and the 2,000-year-old conspiracy that kept quiet about them for 2,000 years or more until women uncovered the truth. So in the ancient Greeks, which were really about 800 BC to 200 AD, which was the ancient Greek period and a little bit later, the Greeks had many myths and stories about Amazons, and a lot of their heroes fought the Amazons. The ancient Greeks were very chauvinistic, and their women were kept under lock and key. They didn't even let them go out of the house very much. They didn't even feed them very much, even the wealthy ones. They celebrated the men, but their women were very subservient and under their thumb. So when they encountered women warriors, it was extremely surprising for them. And very titillating, and they were fascinated with them too, because they were so different than the way they treated their women. So they had all these myths, first of all, with Hercules and other Greek heroes, and they fought Amazons. And in the Greek literature and also all their art, they portrayed the Amazons as fierce warriors that were very heroic. They respected the Amazons' war abilities. They always lost in the stories because of the Greeks always had to be the win. But they respected them more in their literature and their art than they did their other enemies. So but some of the Greek writers wrote about these women, that they actually went to the area they were in, which was mostly southern Russia, Crimea, and the steppes of Asia. And they were nomads. They didn't have a centralized government or written language. They were in small tribes, men and women, and they were in tents and on horses. And they fought on horseback, which is why the women were such good warriors, because when they were on horseback, it equalized the fact that women weren't as strong as men, and they could fight just as well. And they were in small groups, and the women, as I said, had no written language, but they were way more equal than the Greek women. Now, I'm very sorry to say they weren't technically lesbians, as we know lesbians today. I know that's very shocking, and you're all hoping me, but I will not lie. They may have slept with other women too, but they were very lusty with men, and they slept with any men they wanted, which was also very shocking to the Greeks, because they really constrained their wives, and it was terrible for a Greek woman to do that. But they were very lusty, and they would grab a man and have sex with him. And that was actually what they needed to do, because they were very small tribes. So in order to avoid becoming inbred, they had to have sex outside of their group, because otherwise they would have sick babies. And the Greeks, they didn't cut off their breasts. There's no indication they did that. But the Greek writers wrote about them, and they said that they trained their boys and their girls in war. They found all these burial mounds with very rich grave goods and war implements, and they could tell by the bodies that they'd been in battles. But all throughout, so the early Greek writers, some of them actually were in that area, and they wrote about the Amazons as history. But a lot of the other Greek writers later on assumed they were just making it up, because they couldn't believe that women could fight like that. It was so against all their chauvinism about their own women that they couldn't, they said it was fantasy. And actually, for 2,000 years afterwards, in the whole Western civilization said that these women were fantasy, and that women couldn't possibly fight like that. And it wasn't until 1990 when they unearthed these burial mounds in Kurdistan that were mounds, and they found all these bodies in there that were obviously warriors. They'd been buried with swords and knives and gold. They were very, they were very high status. They even sacrificed their horses when they died. But all the archaeologists for thousands of years, including up till 1990, which were mostly men, assumed they were men because women couldn't possibly be warriors. And in 1990, they started DNA testing on these things. And they found out 1/3 of them were women. And you can't argue with DNA. So finally, these Amazons have come to light after this conspiracy of 2,000 years, pretending they didn't even exist. And we have a lot of fun information about what their lives were like. They lived in tents. They smoked weed. I'm sure some of you will be happy to know that. And they actually had these little metal pots, and they would put the weed in there and light it, and then they would close the tent flaps, and then they dance and sing and carouse. And one of the Greek writers described this. And they've actually found these little, in the olden days, all over the world, when a big important person died, they buried them with all the things they were going to need in the afterlife, which is the only reason we know so much about ancient people. Because nowadays, you don't put anything in a grave, but in those days, they would put the little pots in there with little weed in there, and they would bury their weapons and all their jewelry. They had fabulous gold jewelry. They did a lot of trading. They had a very big empire, and they did a lot of trading, and they had beautiful gold jewelry and stuff, and they would bury it all with the person. So when they dug these up, they found that. And also, a lot of the women were very tattooed, and the men too. They would make magical tattoos to give them power in battle. They drank fermented mare's milk, and they got drunk on that. And so they really had more freedom. And there are legends of them in India, China, Egypt, and Persia. And these warrior women were very fierce and respected. In the other countries, when they wrote stories about the Amazons, a lot of times the Amazons won the battles. They actually killed King Cyrus of Persia, who had a huge empire, and a warrior queen defeated him and killed him in battle, and they were very bloodthirsty. And she cut off, I'll take questions afterwards. She cut off his head afterwards and dunked it in a vial of blood and said, "You want blood? Here's blood." I mean, there was no one, they were not someone you want to fool around with. So they did all that, and but they raised their boys and girls to fight. They were mothers. And a lot of ancient countries, if you had a king and a queen in some of these warrior societies, the king would ride off to war and go conquer people, and the queen would be left by herself to run the empire while the husband was away conquering more people. So there were a number of queens that did that, and they led armies on their own in India and China and Persia, and also in other areas of the world. And they did and they were very brave fighters. Some of them stood up against the Romans. There was Queen Boadicea, a Celtic queen. Her husband was killed by the Romans. They raped her daughters, and she got furious and led an army against them and burnt up several Roman cities, and almost defeated the 9th Legion of Rome, but she finally was conquered and she ended up committing suicide. There were 2 young Vietnamese women, sisters, in Vietnam in 200 AD that led an army against the great empire of China, which was a huge empire at that time. And they beat back China for about 5 or 6 years. And China was horrible to their women. I mean, they bound their feet. They were completely bad to their women. And the Vietnamese were more liberal with their women. And these 2 girls and their mother led an army against the Chinese. And they didn't win, but they really kicked ass for a number of years. And then they got defeated and they ended up committing suicide. But these are wonderful stories that you never hear in school. And somebody said, and I don't know who said this, the history is written by the winners. And that's who's won, it's the men, and they've written the history until now, when women are starting to be archaeologists and uncovering all this data. So, and here's another thing, the ancient Mongols, Kublai Khan and all that, their women were warriors also. There was a number of warrior queens in ancient Mongolia. again, the husband would go off and conquer, and the women would lead armies, and they have to protect their the areas. So there was a lot of warriors in there. And another thing is, in the Vikings, the Valorikes, people assumed they were a myth, and there weren't really women warriors in the Vikings until 2017. There was a skeleton in Sweden discovered 100 years ago, a Viking burial. And it was a warrior, a very high status warrior. They had all the weapons there. They had war injuries on the skeleton. And everybody assumed it was a man for 100 years. And there was also a gaming board buried with the body, which was a vehicle not for fun and games, but actually plot strategy in battle. And in 2017, a young archaeologist woman said, you know, that looks like a woman's skeleton to me. And they had a DNA tested. Turned out it was a woman. And they assumed it was a man for 100 years because it was a warrior. So these things are starting to come to light now, and of course we have women in our armed services now who are fierce fighters and very brave and courageous and very capable. And so it's been a very long journey for that, and it's very exciting to study about it. So this is just some information, and I also wanted to say also about Wonder Woman. So now I want to go on to my segment about Wonder Woman. So Wonder Woman was in 1942, and the creator of Wonder Woman is very interesting, and that's what I want to just go on about a little bit about his history. Dr. William Moulton Marston, who was a Harvard psychologist, he was a feminist in 1920 when it was, and he had to keep it secret. He wanted to vote for women. He was a feminist. He was into lesbians, but he kept it all very secret because he would have lost his job otherwise. And he also had a wife, and he also had a girlfriend, and which isn't that known. He had a young graduate student who actually was a niece of Margaret Sanger, who was one of the first women feminists who went for birth control, ended up in jail for trying to help women have contraceptives. Well, this was her niece, but she was under another name, and it was a big secret. And he fell in love with her, and he told his wife, either she moves in or I get divorced. So here he has these two women, and he also was a creator of the lie detector test and Wonder Woman, which you don't have a lasso. That's what you do over there. The lasso of truth for Wonder Woman is she puts the lasso over you and you have to tell the truth. Well, he actually invented the lie detector test. And so they called him in as a consultant to the comic books at the time and said, you know, they're so violent, what can we do? And he said, well, you should have a female superhero. And he designed the character of Wonder Woman. And the young girl, who was the niece of Margaret Sanger, she actually wore bracelets, and that's where he got the idea for the bracelets for Wonder Woman and the lasso of truth. And he made her a superhero, and he often put her in chains, because the symbol of the women's movement was chains, and breaking chains, and freeing yourself from the chains. So he put that a lot in there. And so he lived with these two women for many years until he died. And they both had two children. The children of the other woman never knew that he was their father until way, way later. But, and then the two women lived together for many years after he died. And let's see, I'm just trying to think what else. So Wonder Woman was started in 42, and she was a big hero. In the 50s, after the war, everything got really conservative, and they started downgrading Wonder Woman. In the 60s, she gave up her superpowers for a man, which is appalling thought. Yeah. But in 1972, she was on the cover of Ms. Magazine as a feminist superhero, and then she started regaining her powers after that. And the TV show from 73 to 75, which is Linda Carter, and then There were movies in 2009, 2016, where a writer said she was really a lesbian. And in 2017, we have the latest movie, which was so great, with Gal Gadot. So that's a brief history of the Wonder Woman movement. I know Keith probably has a lot more he wants to say. And I can briefly open it up for questions or discussion now, and you can turn that off.